even in hideous situations, humans are capable of caring for each other. And when we are given the opportunity to do so, we will.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Glam Reaper Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Muldowney, aka the Glam Reaper. And on today's episode, we have a really interesting, I think, honestly, since I was a little child, a really interesting subject. We have Laura as our guest, and she's from the Humane Prison Hospice Project. Laura, welcome to the Glam Reaper Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and it's so nice to meet you.
You too. Yes, absolutely. This is I don't want to say a dream of mine because that kind of sounds a bit weird and creepy. Just always been somebody as a kid, I was always fascinated with sort of living in Ireland. I was always fascinated with programs like the Green Mile is one of my like favorite programs, but like death row and sort of just inmates and like how prison versus jail, like even that's a thing. It was all sort of news to me. And so just then opening up this idea of hospice, for prisoners, like mind blown. I never even thought, Jesus, yeah, like they have health issues too, like other human beings and stuff. So if you want to just tell us a little bit about you, how you got into the project and sort of, yeah, your day to day.
Sure. Well, how I got into working with the Humane Prison Hospice Project is, in hindsight, just a plethora of threads that all kind of came together in a really unexpected way. If you asked me 20 years ago if I thought I'd be doing this work now, I would wonder how on earth I got here. I come from a background of academia.
Okay.
I have an MFA in creative writing, so I taught English, I taught philosophy. And then as I was teaching, both of my parents died back to back in my 20s. Um, so by the time I was 30, both of my parents had died. And I was teaching ethics at the time and realized that the things I enjoyed talking about the most with my students were largely around issues of life and death transitions. And I just decided to follow that thread. I think I'd become a little bit more in tune with my own mortality, and death had always been that big mystery to me that nobody really wanted to talk about or explain.
Yeah.
And much to my dismay, studying philosophy didn't answer any of those questions either. It just created more.
Yeah.
So I quit teaching. I trained as an end of life doula. I began working for a hospice. And while I was working with that hospice, I began working with a group of peer caregivers at the women's prison that was in the area. And they are an incredible group of people. It's a really grassroots group of caregivers who recognized the need to increase their knowledge around caregiving and basically ask for what they needed from the administration and from the community. So I began working with them, and then Humane was hiring a few months later. So it seemed like a really perfect fit. And I've been here for about 3 years now. I
And tell us a little bit about, I mean, that's some journey and it is interesting. I mean, my own journey, and I do think a lot of people who come into this field and weren't sort of born into it, I do think have either been forced to face their mortality or maybe through their own mental health journeys have faced it and kind of come through the other side. And so it's always interesting to hear everybody's stories, and there's a lot of heartbreak obviously in there as well. And nobody should have to face their mortality so young, really. But as we say, it is what it is, and it's the life and death, it's the world, and it's what happens, and it happens in prisons.
Mhm. It does. And it's,
Yeah.
I think, when I went through what I went through, the thing that stuck out the most to me was how isolating grief feels. And I think particularly at a young age, not really knowing very many people who had also been through that, it feels a little bit like you're in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And when I began working with the caregivers at the women's prison, it occurred to me that that isolation is then tenfold, right? Because you're in a correctional setting, which is built to keep you from being seen and heard from the community outside. And so any loss, any grief, any of that that's happening in that setting is just amplified exponentially. And you're right. I mean, the need is the same both inside of prison and outside. We have so many people who are getting older, who are trying to survive chronic illnesses or dealing with terminal illnesses, who don't know how to really ask for or receive the end of life care that they need because it's something that's a little bit hard to find. And in prison, because the environment is what it is, it's very dehumanizing, it's very traumatizing. There's not exactly what I would call a wealth of adequate, compassionate healthcare at hand. Um, People who are incarcerated age physiologically around 2 years to every one faster than people who are not.
Wow.
So if you're going into a system where you're not receiving adequate sounds like such a terrible word to use here, but if you're not receiving good access to healthcare, and you probably weren't receiving it before, any illness that you might have, any of the just things that come along with an aging body or an aging brain are just really emphasized. But the support is so much more lacking.
Right.
So huge need.
Yeah, it's a wild concept to even have, and I'm sure, I know there's going to be people who are listening to this going, well, who cares? They're in prison, and they don't deserve care, and I, people will think of, because I know, I think there's a statistic, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 1 in 6 or 7 people in the US are facing lifetime, not in the US, sorry, in the prison system are facing life sentences. I think that could be, we might have to fact check that.
We can fact check that. Yeah, I think what the statistic I have in my massive statistic document is probably a percentage, but yeah, we can fact check that.
So these
it's more than there should be.
Yeah. And so these people are, they're doing these life sentences. There's no, no potential chance for parole. I don't know, whatever their situation is, but there's a lot of people on life sentences in prison.
Yes.
And, you could nearly compare that to the death row. It's sort of, if you're not providing people with even adequate or remotely basic health care, then are they not on death row? Is that not just a slower, painful? I mean, Christ, I part of me is sort of, I know from having conversations, very open and honest conversations with people, that they sort of say, oh, if this happens to me, or this happens to me, or this happens to me, pull the plug, or, I'd rather, talking about medically assisted suicide is a hot topic right now, and across Europe and stuff like that. And, Jesus, there's some people I'm sure that are on life sentences that would probably prefer to get the needle or the electric chair, or any of these. It's wild. Like, what do you say to somebody who, an average person on the street who would say, well, who cares? They're prisoners, and why should they get health insurance? What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I have probably half a dozen responses to that at hand at any given moment, because whether somebody directly asks us that or not, I am very much always at the ready for it. And it does happen. At the very just surface level, it's a human rights issue. People who are incarcerated do have a right to adequate healthcare. Period. Aside from that, I was telling somebody yesterday, I've been doing this sort of thought experiment with myself. I I ask myself sometimes, has there ever been a moment in history, has there ever been an issue that we have resolved successfully by withdrawing compassion?
Mm-hmm.
Like, has there ever been a situation where less compassion given is somehow the right answer to the problem? And I can't think of one. I think, I've definitely heard it phrased before. Why should somebody who's incarcerated be given compassionate, dignified end of life care if they maybe didn't give that to someone else?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of people experiencing incarceration, I think some of it has to do with a misconception about who's incarcerated.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people I work with were not given compassion ever. And I think it's so much clearer to see the thread between lack of compassion leading to acts in which there is no compassion, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the way that we treat people when we extend that compassion or that dignified care, that's really a reflection on us, not them.
Yeah. Well, in answer to your brain experiments that you're doing on yourself, you're living an active petri dish, an active experiment right now, because compassion isn't being shown for certain groups at the moment in the United States, and so we're an experiment. We're going to find out, I guess, in months and years to come as to whether that worked or it didn't work. We're not going to get into the political of it because we stay neutral, but we're going to find out, I guess, in years to come. But the
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like there isn't precedence. We've,
yeah
we've messed around and found out before, but
yes yes, for sure. The interesting thing though about what you said, like very correctly, and that a bit like yourself, like I kind of think and overthink many different things. Like I was in a car accident many years ago and I knocked somebody over, and that stuck with me forever. And it was her fault. It was the person who was the victim in this scenario, but it was her fault.
right.
Found so fascinating about that was that 10 years previously, I had witnessed a car accident. And without kind of going into too much detail, but there was a truck driver. And I was only a child at the time, I was in my dad's car. And there was a truck driver and a cyclist, what looked like a cyclist, had fallen under the truck, completely and utterly like chopped up into a million different pieces, and obviously died. And I remember by the time our car came to pass the truck driver and he was being obviously interviewed, like just the absolute distraught, like it was just horrific to witness his face. But of course, immediately you're thinking of the cyclist, and of course you should, the victim and the cyclist, and my God, and his life is lost and everything. And it came out, I think it was maybe less than 24 hours later, that the gentleman, the victim, quote unquote, he had actually thrown himself under the truck and tried suicide. And not only that, he had actually axed his mother and his wife and daughter in bed that morning before he performed this act.
Oh,
So it was just, and as a child, sort of, I processed all of this, and they were actually from the area that we were living in at the time. So it was a lot. But when it came then to my accident years later, and thankfully, everything was, all the cars and the witnesses around said, she ran out and it was not, I wasn't found to be liable or anything like that. But it stuck with me, the trauma of seeing a body smash up on my windshield and go flying, and the trauma of seeing a body on the road and not knowing, was she dead, was she alive? I will never forget it as long as I live. And then watching her finally, move. Okay, she's not dead. Okay. Oh my God, is she paralyzed? Like the fascinating parts of the way your brain moves. And then I saw her sit up and she wasn't paralyzed. And thank God she only broke her leg. But in this scenario, she's still the victim, right? And even though I also was a victim, as far as I'm concerned, that truck driver was and the wife and daughter in that scenario that I witnessed as a child were the true victims. our brains are immediately going to sort of, well, the truck driver was driving the weapon, the truck, I was driving the car, the weapon, and so these
Right.
people, just because they're pedestrians doesn't make them completely innocent. And so it's just a very fascinating. So I've always sort of had this, when I hear of an accident on the radio, I actually now immediately think of the driver and how traumatized they could be. And because we just don't know, you don't know the full story of things. And I'm
Right.
saying all of this to say that, we don't know the full story of each. You can't make blanket statements like nobody, in prison on life sentences or whatever, they're all been proven guilty, and so they don't deserve X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be. You can't sort of say that blanket statement because every human being is different. Every person's story is different. We all deal with things differently. And yeah, it's just a really fascinating thing to sort of think about. And we all make mistakes. And as you said, these people weren't shown compassion leading up to whatever incarcerated them for a life sentence. And it's just, yeah, they are human
Yeah.
at the end of the day that maybe made a mistake, were forced into making a mistake, were mentally not able to make the right decision at the time.
Right.
It's just such a fascinating subject. I just recently watched, there was a UK series called Adolescence. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's on
It's on my list.
Yes, it's on Netflix. Oh my God, I just wrote a blog piece on it because I felt so moved by it. But exactly what we're talking about here in the whole series, there's so many victims in it.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give, the story away, and that my blog piece that'll be definitely long out by the time this podcast is released. I don't want to give any spoilers, and it has spoilers in it, but it just goes to show how, our past, our current mental state, all of these things can lead us to doing something that is a mistake, can be rehabilitated, can be reformed. It doesn't mean we're completely and utterly evil people, but then how do you, I'm going off on a tangent because I'm just so,
No, it's okay.
yeah,
Well, and it's so layered,
it is.
it's complex. And I think, as humans in general, we're not always great at handling complex,
Yeah.
multi-layered concepts. We very much like kind of thinking in binaries. This is wrong, this is right, this is this is that. And, holding two things that are true at the same time, I think can be difficult. I think at a really just core level, I don't think anybody, first of all, wants to be defined by the worst mistake they ever made or the worst thing that they ever did. I certainly don't. Um, and I also, and this is just maybe my optimistic, personal, humanistic belief, but I really don't believe that the vast majority of people wake up one day and decide to do harm,
Yeah.
decide to do bad. Um, I am sure that those people exist. I don't think that it's the rule by any means. And, the fact of the matter is, when we work with peer caregivers who are incarcerated, the amount of empathy and commitment and conviction in their caregiving work is astounding.
Yeah.
It knocks me off my feet each and every time because I've trained hospice volunteers in the community. I've been one. I know caregivers. I've been a caregiver, clearly. And perhaps it's because the stakes are so much higher. Perhaps it's because there is nowhere else to turn and no one else generally to rely on for that support. The ways in which they really support each other in these extremely vulnerable, tumultuous moments are just exceptional. And it's something that I wish people could see and experience for themselves, because there are so many ideas about people who are incarcerated who have done this crime or that crime. And I think it's very easy for people to imagine that this is the backstory and this is what got them there and these are the facts and that's it.
Mm.
And, when you really hear stories and get to know people over, in some cases, in my own experience, over a number of years, any of those preconceived ideas just completely flipped on their head.
Mm.
I think it's a small way of thinking that, and I think it's a dangerous way of thinking too, that we decide that these particular groups of people, under these particular parameters are not somehow deserving of care or consideration. That's a dangerous slope, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the basic of, gosh, like, I mean, I don't necessarily want to be referencing the Holocaust at the moment, but like, it comes back to sort of, branding people, branding a certain group that they must be treated a certain way, and things like the Innocent Project, I think is not the name of it, the Innocent, like that wouldn't exist if these people, there wasn't some people who shouldn't be in those situations that are, in fact, because of different biases, are in those situations. So you can't blanket, even if we could come to an agreement on, yes, everybody who is a murderer doesn't deserve, even if we could come to that, unfortunately, the justice system isn't, the legal system isn't a justice system. It's
Right.
It's not, and it has bias. And I mean, I think there's definitely a documentary on what you just described there. I'm not sure if there is a documentary on prison hospice, but I think there definitely should be. There is? Oh my gosh. Well,
Yeah, actually, Edgar Behrens, who is one of my dear colleagues here at Humane, he filmed a documentary called Prison Terminal about 12 years ago, perhaps. He spent 6 months getting to know the guys at the Iowa State Penitentiary and following the hospice program there. And although he made it, I think 12 years ago, it was nominated for an Academy Award, actually. We still use it as a teaching tool when we do presentations and conferences and such, because it's such a great example of what these programs can look like when given, the support and when they're believed in and championed.
yeah.
And they can happen and they can be beautiful and they can give people dignity at the end of their lives. But it also, it's really, really hard to quantify something like purpose. But, for people who are working as caregivers and doing this incredible job, they may not have been given an opportunity before in their lives to be a person who provides such an important, loving service to members of their community. Sometimes because people just didn't believe that they could because of things that they may have done. And that's exceptionally moving, that when it comes down to it, even in hideous situations, humans are capable of caring for each other. And when we are given the opportunity to do so, we will.
Yeah. I mean, you even, again, showing my my weirdness growing up as a child, but I used to love Rose.
It's okay, I have it too.
I think a lot of us do, honestly, because there would
Yeah.
think that the shows, the Netflix shows like the Menendez brothers and the How to Make a Murderer and all these huge hit shows would not be hits if there wasn't all little, closet people who love all these true crimes and stuff. But even when you look at those, like those were, people who now potentially could be released, or it's mind blowing, honestly. But and it's also to say that, like, I know in Norway, I'm from Ireland, so obviously Europe is but like in Norway, I believe they have a great rehabilitation program, and from, again, facts, I always double check my facts because I have a head like a sieve. But I believe like 20% or something along those lines of people who are rehabilitated. I think this is sort of a new statistic. Are only 20% are likely to commit a crime within 2 years of release, something like that. I mean, that's amazing. That means 80%. Okay, I know it says within 2 years, so you would hope, but 80% are not going back to a life of crime.
Right.
That's incredible. I mean, and you mentioned there about compassion. Even the stories that I've read growing up about these crazy serial killers and stuff, the majority of them committed the crimes based on how they were raised as children, the history of abuse or mental illness in the family. But even still, a lot of them showed compassion for either their mother, their father, a sibling. Like, while they did these heinous crimes and these horrific things, there was somebody in their life that they loved and cared for. So there was still love and compassion in there somewhere. They just had this illness, this sick sort of something that just.
Yeah. And I think too, when we're talking about people who have experienced a lot of trauma, who have experienced the results of, their parents' trauma, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, um, when we're in survival mode,
Yeah.
and we're just trying to cope, we don't always make good choices. We choose the next best thing that's going to make sure we get up tomorrow and can feed ourselves and our family.
Yeah.
We're not thinking about much beyond that. I've definitely been in that place before. I think many people have. And so it's not a far stretch to imagine, that if I'm a person who has, experienced X, Y, and Z things, and I don't have any resources, and I don't have support, and I don't have this or that, and nobody cares.
Yeah.
What can happen?
Yeah. Like, sleep deprivation is a huge one. I mean, I'm very blessed in the sense that I've always had clothes on my back and food to put in my mouth and a roof over my head and stuff. But there's certainly been times where I've had to either work through the night, or I don't have kids, so I haven't experienced that. But I've actually said to my friends, I'm like, I can actually understand how, and this is going to sound like a horrific thing to say, but I can understand how a parent would mentally just black out with a child, when if you were sleep deprived that much. Like, I could literally understand how you would reach your boiling point, and you wouldn't mean to do anything, but you just snap and you do something, and then.
Yeah. And I've gotten to know a lot of people who have at some point really gone into more detail about, their backstory and the things that happened. And it, a lot of cases, there's almost an out of body kind of blackout experience that happens. And of course, that's not to excuse any of it.
None of
we don't get to harm other people, but I think it speaks to that idea again, that two things can be true at the same time. I think people are capable of doing horrible things to one another. I mean, we see it all the time,
every day.
but that doesn't negate the fact that they may have a huge capacity for care and empathy for other people.
Yeah.
It's just not that simple.
Yeah, it really, really isn't. So tell us, Laura, the hospice project, are the prisoners caring for other prisoners? And do you have outside people, like trained, professionals like yourself, assisting them, or do you lead and they assist you, or how does the actual project work when you've got a prisoner that's on hospice? Like, maybe give us what a day looks like, or a case looks like, maybe.
Sure. Well, the general overview is that we like to begin at a prison by doing a needs assessment. Every prison has a different population, a different culture, different dynamics between the people who live there and work there. And so once we have a better understanding of the needs of a particular location, we can tailor our training program to better meet those needs. So the caregivers who we work with are incarcerated, and they provide care for their incarcerated friends and chosen family, community members. And it's really important that these programs are peer-led. We really believe that the people who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, that people who are incarcerated together and share that lived experience are better equipped to understand the unique needs. We go in to provide training and support really just as a matter of refining a lot of pre-existing skills. We can have an idea of the number of peer-led programs like this in the United States. Our best guess is that out of 1,800 United States prisons, there are probably 75 with a hospice or palliative care program. Probably half of those are peer-led. But we go in and just sort of help to bolster the skill set and really empower caregivers in doing the work that they're doing. There are places that we go where there is no caregiving group already in existence, and will help with that process, sort of the recruitment of people working in it. But oftentimes there is already an informal group of folks who are providing care to other members in their community, and that's where we start. And we have a curriculum that I think is really, really well-rounded. It covers a lot of practical hands-on care. So how to use certain bedside equipment, understanding the paperwork of healthcare, advanced directives, things like that. But it also covers cultural competency and humility, spirituality, grief and loss, trauma-informed care, and healing-centered engagement. So it's very, very comprehensive and really trains caregivers to be able to provide care, palliative care, geriatric care, end-of-life care, and also increasingly memory care. I think the current statistics that I was just reading in a study are that people who are incarcerated have a 60% greater chance of developing Alzheimer's or some other kind of dementia. So that's definitely a need that we're helping to address.
Yeah. And these peers, I'm assuming, but again, assuming is always a bad thing. The question of being curious, is these peers, I presume the majority of them, or maybe some of them, do have medical training, but that they don't have necessarily access to drugs and various different, obviously I'm sure there has to be some sort of safety protocols, and ensuring that they are in fact peers, because I'm sure there's misleading relationships in prisons and stuff where somebody is not in fact part, what is the word, part of the friendship or the relationship, voluntarily, shall we say. Is there ever a risk that the person, I guess the quote unquote caregiver, could be of danger to the person they're allegedly trying to care? Is there ever anything with that, or that maybe they're doing it to get a hold of medical equipment? Like, is there maybe medical isn't a part of the program you're?
So I mean, there's always a risk, and we work closely with both correctional healthcare staff and the custody staff to sort of mitigate those risks. I will say that, sort of there's a twofold answer here. One is that these programs, informal or formal, however they begin, are very, very fragile. And for the people who are working as caregivers in them, that is not lost on them. And it's very, very, very important that they are seen as professionals, that they are taken seriously, that they are respected, and that there's knowledge about the care that they offer.
Yeah.
So the second part of that answer is that, in the best case scenario, if we're recruiting at a particular location a new cohort of caregivers to be trained, it's really, really vital that caregivers already working in that group have some say in that. because, we can participate in an interview alongside correctional staff and kind of look at everybody's paperwork and ask them questions. But at the end of the day, the people who have a much better idea about how a potential caregiver sort of exists within the community are the people in that community.
Yeah.
And so there have been times for sure where, maybe somebody applies and they may have ulterior motives. It's not usually around drugs. It's usually around this may look really good in front of the parole board or something of that nature. And that person may look really great on paper. And then, the caregivers will say, well, you should know this though. And it's not always a deal breaker. We try to, I think, kind of weigh everything evenly, but it is good to know. The people who are caregivers who work together, they do a great job of kind of keeping each other in check and, voicing concerns when we go in to provide ongoing support. It's really, really important to them that these programs are sustained and believed in and that they don't disappear because they're so needed.
Yeah.
And then, as far as kind of details are concerned, they vary by location because, again, every prison's so different and has different needs. But typically there are some requirements that need to be met. I've seen requirements like you can't have any drug-related infractions from the last 3 years, or you don't have any charges related to like elder abuse, things like that.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, really the whole concept, when you boil it all down and think about it, it's as we've always done around death. It's community looking after its own community. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. Like, being from Ireland, that's, and I have a course on Irish traditions in the funeral space, and that was very much what it was one person, not necessarily professional, but they had experience in this. They would maybe wash the body. Another person, the carpenter in the town, would make the coffin, and the bartender, the local bar would supply the whiskey, and just everyone coming together to help this person to die, and then to be buried and on into the next life, if that's, which in Ireland they did believe that. But so it's really, that's what this project to me boils down to, is just community looking after community, and how can we best support that and help make that happen. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
And it really is. It's community helping community, because I realized I didn't speak to one of your questions earlier, but we do have people out in the community who also come in and help. People who are volunteer facilitators with us, who may be hospice nurses, social workers, chaplains, really forming relationships with this caregiving community who's then taking care of their own, and not just in direct, hands-on patient care, but also really addressing the grief and the loss needs of the entire population. So the work that they do is, it's really, really incredible. And even though it's painful and often thankless, they show up every time.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, we need more people like that in the world. We need more compassion in the world, not less, people.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Laura. This was super interesting and definitely something I've been dying to discuss. So thank you so much for joining us and just educating us on this. And I hope more people out there will reach out to you, or like will investigate, in their local areas, like what's going on with this, and just generally start to be curious. People, don't be judgmental, be curious. That's all I would say.
Yes. Always be curious. That I don't know mindset is a great place to start every time.
Exactly. That's right. We love that. Thank you so much, Laura. Great talking to you.
Thank you so much.